Nexus Prime Station hung in the void like a monument to bureaucratic overreach, its gleaming chrome surfaces reflecting the light of 3 different suns in what the architects probably thought was an inspiring display of unity. In reality, it looked like someone had fed a government building through a blender and then taught it to orbit. The station served as the galaxy's premier checkpoint for anyone foolish enough to want entry into the inner colonies, where civilization supposedly reached its peak and common sense went to die. The security checkpoint itself was a masterpiece of engineering incompetence, designed by the hegemony's finest minds, beings who had collectively witnessed approximately 0 actual conflicts. It featured scanning technology so advanced it could detect the molecular composition of a passenger's breakfast from 17 parsecs away, yet somehow consistently failed to identify actual weapons. The irony was not lost on those forced to endure its ministrations, though expressing such observations aloud would result in additional screening procedures that made root canal surgery seem like a pleasant afternoon activity. The humans stood in line 47B, designated for carbon-based bipedal entities with standard atmospheric requirements, watching a Vorthaki merchant 3 positions ahead attempt to explain to the security drone that yes, his tentacles were supposed to be that color, and they were not concealing contraband. The explanation was proceeding about as well as one might expect from a conversation between a creature that communicated through bioluminescent patterns and a machine programmed by beings who thought emotion was a software glitch. Behind the reinforced transparent barrier that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets, the security team operated with the smooth efficiency of molasses in a supernova. The coordinator, a jellyfish-like entity whose species had evolved in the peaceful depths of their homeworld's oceans, floated in a specialized atmospheric tank while processing each decision with the lightning-fast speed of geological formation. Its neural pathways, evolved for contemplating the philosophical implications of krill consumption, were not particularly well suited to the rapid-fire decision-making required by modern security protocols. The scanner technician, blessed with compound eyes that could theoretically see in 17 different spectrums simultaneously, had somehow managed to miss the obviously weaponized energy source the Catherian diplomat was wearing as jewelry. This was particularly impressive considering the device was actively humming with enough power to level a city block and glowing bright enough to serve as a navigation beacon. The technician's mandibles clicked in concentration as it stared at its readouts, apparently convinced that the human's water bottle represented a more significant threat to galactic security. Overseeing this circus of competence was the administrator, a crystalline being whose species had evolved intimidation displays that involved very slow, very subtle color changes. What might have been terrifying to prey species on their homeworld translated to the galactic stage as roughly equivalent to watching paint dry if paint could achieve new levels of bureaucratic smugness. The administrator's current shade, a sort of aggressive beige, was apparently meant to convey authority and inspire compliance. Instead, it mostly inspired thoughts about interior decorating mistakes. The line moved with the relentless speed of entropy, each passenger processed through a series of scans, forms, additional scans, supplementary forms, and the occasional emergency scan when someone sneezed too loudly. The forms themselves were available in 17 different languages, though apparently none of the translators had ever actually met a human based on the creative interpretations of basic anatomy presented in the document. The section requesting number of functional respiratory vents was particularly optimistic. The biometric scanners, marvels of technology that could map the quantum signature of a being's soul, proved baffled by human fingerprint. The machines had been calibrated for species with sensible evolutionary choices, beings who had developed energy-based appendages, crystalline manipulation matrices, or simply evolved beyond the need for physical interaction with their environment. The concept of skin that wasn't semi-transparent, self-repairing, or capable of photosynthesis was apparently beyond their programming parameters. When the human finally reached the front of the line, after a wait that had lasted long enough for several nearby stellar systems to complete their orbital cycles, the scanner technician's compound eyes focused on her with the intensity of a being who had been staring at readouts for approximately 14 consecutive hours and was beginning to question both their career choices and the fundamental nature of reality. "Citizen," the technician buzzed, its voice carrying the particular quality of someone reading from a script they had never quite understood. "You are required to remove your environmental suit for standard deep tissue scanning protocol." The instruction hung in the recycled air like a particularly ominous fortune cookie. While behind the barrier, the security team prepared to encounter their first real education in human resilience. The environmental suit came off with the soft hiss of decompressing seal, and what was revealed beneath could generously be described as a topographical map of questionable life choices. The human's skin told a story that would have made epic poets weep, if epic poets were in the habit of documenting what appeared to be a decades-long campaign against common sense and basic safety protocol. The scanner technician's compound eyes, each individually capable of resolving detail down to the molecular level, suddenly found themselves staring at what could only be described as biological impossibility. Across the human's back ran 3 parallel lines, each approximately 15 centimeters long, that had healed into raised scar tissue with the distinctive pattern of something very sharp dragged across flesh with considerable force. The mathematical precision of the spacing suggested claws, large ones, belonging to something that had seriously considered turning this particular human into a light snack. The technician's mandibles began clicking in a rhythm that suggested either deep concentration or the early stages of a complete nervous breakdown. Its scanning equipment, marvels of engineering that could detect a virus hiding behind a molecule, started producing readouts that defied both logic and the fundamental laws of medicine as understood by civilized species. Coordinator. The technician buzzed, its voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose worldview was currently being fed through a paper shredder. We have anomalous reading. The coordinator's jellyfish-like form pulsed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a being whose evolutionary history had not prepared it for crisis management. In the peaceful depths of their homeworld's oceans, the most pressing decision their species typically faced was whether to drift left or right around a particularly interesting piece of kelp. The concept of tissue damage that didn't immediately result in death was as foreign to them as quantum mechanics was to a goldfish. Define anomalous. The coordinator gurgled, its voice carrying the liquid quality of someone speaking through several tons of specialized breathing fluid. The scanner technician's compound eyes swiveled to focus on a circular pattern on the human's shoulder, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, that appeared to be composed of smaller circular impressions arranged in a perfect ring. Any being with a basic understanding of predatory anatomy would recognize it immediately as the sucker pattern of something very large, very strong, and very interested in testing the tensile strength of human flesh. The subject displays extensive scarification consistent with. The technician paused, consulting its database with the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast repository of galactic knowledge, there might be a reasonable explanation for what it was looking at. With encounters involving class, the administrator's crystalline form began cycling through colors with increasing rapidity, progressing from bureaucratic beige, through worried yellow, to what could only be described as panicked magenta. In their species' evolutionary history, rapid color changes were reserved for truly catastrophic events, the kind that ended with entire mountain ranges being relocated and fundamental constants of physics being treated as mere suggestion. Impossible, the administrator chimed, its harmonic voice now carrying overtones of existential dread. Class X12 entities are theoretical constructs. They exist only in the folklore of primitive species, who lack proper understanding of natural selection. The human, meanwhile, stood patiently in the scanning chamber, displaying the sort of casual indifference to scrutiny that suggested either supreme confidence or a complete disconnection from reality. Her posture was relaxed, almost bored, as if being examined by panicking aliens was merely another minor inconvenience in what was probably a very long list of minor inconveniences. The scanner technician's equipment began producing error codes in 17 different languages, most of which roughly translated to "what the hell is this thing?" The advanced medical algorithms, designed by the galaxy's finest minds to analyze the biological patterns of civilized species, were encountering data that simply didn't fit any known category of survivable injury. A series of small, perfectly round puncture marks along the human's forearm suggested teeth, numerous, sharp teeth belonging to something that had apparently decided to test whether humans were edible and had reached a conclusion that was clearly unsatisfactory to all parties involved. The spacing and depth indicated a creature roughly the size of a large predator, though the fact that the human was standing there looking mildly annoyed rather than being digested, suggested that the encounter had not proceeded according to the predator's original plan. "Sir," the technician's voice had risen several octaves, entering frequencies typically reserved for emergency broadcasts. I'm detecting additional scarification patterns consistent with thermal damage, projectile impacts, and what appears to be chemical burn. The coordinator's pulsing rhythm had accelerated to approximately the speed of a hummingbird's heartbeat, which in their species typically indicated either intense sexual arousal or impending cardiac failure. Given the circumstances, the latter seemed more likely. Emergency protocols began activating throughout the security checkpoint as various automated systems detected the elevated stress levels of the security team and reached the logical conclusion that they were under attack. Warning lights bathed the area in crimson, while speakers began broadcasting evacuation instructions in 47 different languages, including several that consisted entirely of interpretive dance moves. The human raised an eyebrow at the chaos erupting around her, displaying the sort of mild curiosity typically reserved for watching clouds form interesting shapes. Her expression suggested that mass panic among alien security forces was neither particularly surprising nor particularly concerning, which only served to accelerate the administrator's color cycling into frequencies that were beginning to affect the station's navigation equipment. "Citizen," the administrator finally managed, its harmonic voice now resembling a choir of angels, having a collective nervous breakdown. "Our scans indicate you have sustained injuries, consistent with encounters with Class Et-12 mythological entities. Please explain how you are still alive." The question hung in the recycled air like a challenge to the fundamental laws of biology, while the human's expression shifted to something that might charitably be called amusement. "Which scars specifically?" she asked, her tone carrying the patient quality of someone who had clearly had this conversation before.
The human's question, delivered with the casual tone of someone asking about the weather, sent the security team into what could politely be described as advanced intellectual disarray. The scanner technician's compound eyes began focusing and refocusing with the frantic energy of someone trying to process information that fundamentally violated everything they understood about mortality, survival, and the basic courtesy of staying dead when mortally wounded. "Begin with the dorsal lacerations," the administrator chimed, its crystalline form now cycling through colors that existed primarily in the ultraviolet spectrum, which was the administrator equivalent of screaming. "Our analysis indicates claw patterns consistent with a greater dracoform. Subspecies unknown. Estimated length 40 to 60 meters. The human glanced over her shoulder at the 3 parallel scars running across her back, the sort of casual inspection one might give to a mildly interesting cloud formation. "Oh, those. Bicycle accident when I was 12. Went down a hill that was probably too steep, hit some gravel and slid about 15 meters on my back across what we call asphalt. It's a rough surface we use for roads." The coordinator's pulsing rhythm stopped entirely for approximately 14 seconds, long enough for several nearby star systems to wonder if time itself had malfunctioned. When it resumed, the pattern suggested a being whose fundamental understanding of cause and effect had been fed through a blender and served back as abstract art. "Asphalt," the coordinator gurgled, the word emerging from its translation matrix with the sort of reverence typically reserved for the names of ancient gods or particularly virulent diseases. "You refer to weaponized terrain. We drive on it," the human replied with the patient tone of someone explaining that water was wet. "Every day. Sometimes we run on it for fun." The scanner technician's mandibles began producing a sound that could generously be described as mechanical sobbing. In its database, surfaces rough enough to flay skin from bone were classified as environmental weapons of mass destruction, typically found only on death worlds where evolution had apparently gotten bored and decided to experiment with creative forms of extinction. "The circular pattern on your shoulder," the administrator managed, its harmonic voice now carrying overtones that suggested imminent psychological collapse. "Our analysis indicates contact with a deep-sea leviathan, tentacle span estimated at 40 meters, suction force sufficient to crush battle armor." The human rotated her shoulder to get a better look at the perfectly circular scar that had sent the alien's equipment into mathematical conniption. "That's from a playground when I was 8. It's called a merry-go-round, a rotating platform that children sit on for entertainment. I held on too tight when it was spinning and got what we call a friction burn from the metal handle." The explanation hit the security team with the force of a small asteroid. In their collective databases, any device capable of generating sufficient rotational force to damage flesh was classified as either a torture implement or an industrial centrifuge. neither of which civilized species typically allowed their offspring to interact with voluntarily. You allow your young to operate heavy machinery, the coordinator stated, the words emerging as less of a question and more of a horrified realization. For recreation, kids love that stuff, the human confirmed cheerfully. The faster it goes, the more fun they have. We also have these things called slides, basically ramps that launch children through the air at high velocity, and swings that use gravity and momentum to stop. The administrator's harmonic voice reached frequencies that caused several nearby navigation instruments to recalibrate themselves. Please proceed to the puncture wounds on your forearm. The human examined the neat row of small round scars that had convinced the scanning equipment it was looking at the aftermath of a feeding frenzy. Dog bite. I was 6, tried to take a bone away from our neighbor's pet. Rex was his name. That's the dog, not the neighbor. About 30 kilograms, very friendly most of the time, but apparently had strong opinions about property rights. The scanner technician's database immediately began cross-referencing dog and returned results that caused several processing cores to shut down entirely. According to Galactic records, humans shared their living spaces with creatures that were classified as pack-hunting predators with crushing jaw strength, sufficient to sever limbs. The fact that they called these creatures pets, and allowed them unsupervised access to their children suggested a species-wide death wish of unprecedented scope. The thermal damage patterns, the coordinator whispered, its voice carrying the quality of someone who was no longer entirely certain they were awake. Plasma burns, energy weapon discharge, cooking accident, the human replied with a shrug. I was making something we call bacon. It's meat that we heat up in a metal pan until it's hot enough to cause third-degree burns. The grease splattered. Happens all the time. This revelation sent the administrator through a color spectrum that included several shades that had never been observed in nature and were probably illegal in most civilized systems. The concept of deliberately exposing food to temperatures sufficient to cause severe tissue damage, and then consuming said food, suggested a species that had not merely failed to evolve past their primitive survival instincts, but had actively weaponized their own nutrition. The chemical burns, the scanner technician managed, its voice now resembling the death rattles of a malfunctioning translation matrix. Swimming pool maintenance. Something called chlorine. We add it to water to kill bacteria. Then we immerse ourselves in the treated water for I spilled some of the concentrated chemical on my leg when I was mixing it. Stung a bit. The security team's collective silence stretched on for long enough that several nearby pulsars completed their rotational cycles. The concept of voluntarily submerging oneself in chemically treated water that was toxic enough to serve as a disinfectant was so far beyond their understanding of rational behavior that their translation matrices had apparently given up and gone home. Citizen, the administrator finally managed, its harmonic voice now carrying undertones that suggested a being contemplating early retirement. Our records indicate that your homeworld is classified as a pastoral garden world, Class 2 habitability rate, yet your scarification patterns suggest exposure to environmental hazards consistent with Tuesday, the human finished helpfully. That was all stuff that happened on fairly typical days. You should see what my cousin looks like. She's a professional rock climber. That means she scales vertical cliff faces for entertainment. The coordinator's pulsing pattern had devolved into something that resembled a heart monitor during cardiac arrest. Somewhere in the depths of its oceanic consciousness, a terrible realization was beginning to form, a suspicion that everything they thought they knew about the galaxy was about to be revised in the most unsettling way possible. The mention of rock climbing, which the security team's translation matrices had helpfully defined as voluntary engagement with gravity-assisted death scenarios for recreational purposes, appeared to be the final straw that broke what little remained of their collective sanity. The administrator's color cycling had reached strobe light intensity, creating a light show that was beginning to interfere with navigation systems 3 sectors away. Emergency protocols that had been designed for scenarios involving hostile alien invasions were now activating in response to what was apparently a perfectly normal human having a perfectly normal conversation about perfectly normal human activity. The coordinator had begun making soft gurgling sounds that suggested either deep philosophical contemplation or the early stages of a complete neurological shutdown. In the peaceful evolutionary history of their species, the most dangerous thing they had ever encountered was a particularly aggressive piece of seaweed. The concept of a species that treated mortal peril as a minor inconvenience was so far beyond their comprehension that their consciousness was beginning to fold in on itself like origami made of existential dread. Citizen, the scanner technician managed, its compound eyes now focusing in 17 different directions simultaneously. Please define typical Tuesday. The human's expression shifted to something that might charitably be called thoughtful. Well, yesterday I got up, had coffee. That's a stimulant we consume that's technically toxic in large quantities. Then I drove to work in my automobile. That's a metal box that moves at high velocity using controlled explosion. On the way I stopped to get fuel, which is basically refined explosive liquid that we pump into our vehicles while standing next to it. Each revelation hit the security team like a series of increasingly large hammers. Their databases were frantically cross-referencing human activities and returning classification codes that were beginning to read like a catalog of war crimes against basic survival instincts. At work, the human continued with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. I operated what we call power tools, handheld devices that use high-speed rotating metal discs to cut through various materials. Then I had lunch, which included something called sushi. That's raw fish that we eat without cooking it first to kill potential parasites. The administrator had progressed beyond simple color changes and was now emitting light patterns that were probably visible from the next solar system. Several nearby ships had begun adjusting their courses to avoid what their sensors were interpreting as either a stellar phenomenon or a very large explosion. After work I went to something called a gym. The human continued, apparently oblivious to the psychological carnage she was inflicting. That's where we deliberately subject ourselves to physical stress by lifting heavy objects repeatedly until our muscles tear. Then we consume protein supplements and do it again the next day. The scanner technician's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, frozen in an expression that suggested a being whose understanding of cause and effect had been permanently damaged. In its database, deliberate tissue damage was classified under either torture methods or advanced interrogation techniques, neither of which civilized species typically performed on themselves voluntarily. The evening was relaxing, the human added helpfully. I watched something called the news, which is where we learn about all the various ways other humans have died recently. Then I took a hot shower. That's where we expose ourselves to water heated to near scalding temperatures, and went to sleep. The coordinator's pulsing had become so erratic that nearby medical equipment was beginning to emit concerned beeping sounds. Somewhere in its oceanic consciousness, a terrible understanding was beginning to crystallize. The classification of Earth as a pastoral garden world was beginning to seem less like an administrative oversight, and more like the greatest intelligence failure in galactic history. Sir, the scanner technician whispered, its voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose worldview had been professionally demolished. I believe we may need to reconsider our threat assessment protocol. The administrator's harmonic voice, when it finally emerged, sounded like a choir of angels, who had been informed that the universe was actually a comedy show and they were the punchline. Citizen, our database indicates that your homeworld surface temperature variations can reach extremes of -40 to +50 degrees Celsius. How do your people survive such conditions? Oh, we just wear different clothes, the human replied with a shrug. In winter we put on coats, in summer we take them off. Sometimes we go outside specifically because the weather is trying to kill us. We call it hiking or camping or extreme sports. Last year my brother went skydiving. That's where you jump out of a perfectly functional aircraft while it's flying and hope your parachute works. The revelation that humans voluntarily ejected themselves from aircraft for entertainment purposes appeared to be the moment when the administrator's capacity for rational thought finally surrendered to the inevitable. Its crystalline form began emitting a steady, pure tone that sounded remarkably like a species-wide scream of existential horror. The weather patterns on your world, the coordinator managed, its voice now resembling the last gasps of a dying translation matrix, include phenomena classified as hurricanes, tornadoes, and blizzards. These are categorized as Class 7 natural disasters capable of leveling entire city. Yeah, we get those, the human confirmed cheerfully. Some people actually chase tornadoes in vehicles for fun. They call themselves storm chasers. And hurricanes are just really big storms. We board up our windows and wait for them to pass. Sometimes we have hurricane parties where we get together and drink alcohol while the storm tries to destroy our homes. The security checkpoint had fallen into a silence so profound that it was beginning to affect local space-time. Emergency klaxons continued to wail in 47 languages, warning of threats that the automated systems couldn't properly categorize because their threat assessment matrices had apparently achieved sentience and immediately filed for political asylum. Citizen, the administrator finally whispered, its harmonic voice now carrying undertones that suggested a being who had stared into the abyss and discovered it was filing insurance claims. "We are beginning to suspect that our classification of your species may have been incomplete." "How so?" the human asked with genuine curiosity. "We have been operating under the assumption that humans were a typical sapient species from a benign garden world," the scanner technician explained, its compound eyes now focused on distant points in space as if seeking escape routes. "However, your casual descriptions of daily life suggest that your people routinely survive encounters with phenomena that would qualify as extinction-level events for most galactic civilizations." The human considered this for a moment. "I suppose it depends on your perspective. We just call it living, though I guess other species might find it a bit challenging." A new and terrible realization was beginning to dawn on the security team. If humans considered their own homeworld merely a bit challenging, and if they routinely survived things that would terrorize galactic civilization, then perhaps the real question wasn't whether this particular human had survived encounters with mythological creatures. Perhaps the real question was whether humans were the mythological creatures that other species told cautionary tales about around their fires at night. The administrator's color cycling suddenly stopped, settling into a shade that could best be described as the color of someone who had just realized they had been guarding the wrong end of the tunnel. "Citizen," it managed, "you are cleared for passage. Please proceed to gate 4. The instruction was delivered with the sort of urgent politeness typically reserved for defusing unexploded ordnance, or negotiating with entities of cosmic horror. As the human collected her environmental suit and walked toward the exit, the security team watched her go with the sort of respectful terror usually reserved for natural disasters with a sense of humor. Behind her, other humans were beginning to approach the checkpoint, each presumably carrying their own collection of what they probably considered minor inconveniences, and what galactic civilization was about to reclassify as evidence of survival capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. The scanner technician's equipment had begun displaying a new message in friendly, helpful text: "Recommended action, consider career change." For once the machine was probably right.